October 14, 37,000 feet over the Atlantic. Captain Hayes announces the unthinkable, "We're going down." Screams fill the cabin. Then, a 12-year-old girl walks into the cockpit with impossible calm. "I can fly this," she whispers. Her father taught her secrets no manual contains. Now, 247 souls depend on her. Before you watch full story, comment below from which country are you watching. Don't forget to subscribe for more amazing stories. The Boeing 777 cruised at 37,000 feet over the North Atlantic, carrying 247 souls through the darkness between continents. The massive aircraft cut through the night sky with the quiet confidence of modern engineering, its twin engines humming in perfect synchronization as it followed an invisible highway drawn across the ocean by satellites and computers. In seat 14C, 12-year-old Maya Chen pressed her forehead against the cold window, watching distant lightning flicker through cloud formations that resembled mountains in the night. The electrical storms were at least 50 miles away, far enough to pose no danger, close enough to paint the darkness with nature's violent beauty. She'd made this journey dozens of times before, back when her father occupied the captain's seat of aircraft just like this one, back when every flight felt like an adventure shared between father and daughter. Back when aviation was her entire world, not just a bittersweet memory wrapped in grief that she carried everywhere like invisible luggage that never got lighter no matter how much time passed. 2 years. 730 days since the training accident that took both her parents in a single catastrophic moment. Her father in the instructor's seat, her mother waiting on the ground to celebrate his promotion to chief training captain. The investigation report said it was a mechanical failure compounded by weather conditions, a perfect storm of circumstances that even the most skilled pilot couldn't have survived. Maya had read that report 17 times, memorizing every technical detail, searching for something she could have changed if she'd been there, if she'd somehow known. The flight attendants moved through the cabin with practiced efficiency, collecting dinner trays and offering coffee to passengers settling in for the long transatlantic crossing. The lead flight attendant, a woman in her 40s with kind eyes and practiced smile, paused at Maya's row. "Can I get you anything, sweetheart? Some juice? A snack?" Maya declined politely with a small shake of her head, her attention focused on the subtle vibrations she felt through the airframe, the particular hum of the twin engines that most passengers never consciously registered. To her, it was a symphony, the high-frequency whine of the turbines, the deeper rumble of airflow over the wings, the rhythmic pulse of hydraulic systems maintaining pressure throughout the aircraft's control surfaces. Her father had taught her to listen to aircraft the way musicians listen to orchestras, detecting the harmony or discord in systems working together in precise synchronization. Everything felt normal. Everything felt safe. She allowed herself to relax, pulling out the thick aviation manual she'd been reading, Advanced Emergency Procedures for Multi-Engine Aircraft, one of dozens she'd consumed voraciously since the accident. The manual detailed emergency procedures for dual-engine failure scenarios, technical material far beyond typical 12-year-old reading but perfectly comprehensible to Maya. The pages were worn from repeated study, margins filled with her notes and observations, cross-references to other manuals and case studies she'd analyzed. Her father had started teaching her when she was 6 years old, explaining flight principles with the infinite patience of someone who believed aviation represented humanity's greatest achievement. "Look at this, Maya," he'd say, holding up a model airplane. "Humans aren't meant to fly. We don't have wings. But we figured it out anyway through pure determination and understanding physics. That's what makes aviation so beautiful, it's proof that we can overcome our natural limitations." By 8, she was spending hours in professional flight simulators he'd arranged access to through pilot friends who recognized his daughter's extraordinary aptitude. The simulator sessions became their special time together, father and daughter tackling scenarios that challenged even experienced aviators. He'd program impossible emergencies into the system, then talk her through the solutions, teaching her to think beyond checklists and procedures to understand the fundamental principles that govern flight. Aviation authorities create rules and procedures based on what's known and proven, he'd explained during one particularly difficult session where they'd lost all hydraulics over the Pacific. But real emergencies don't always follow the script. You need to understand the why behind every procedure so you can adapt when the situation demands it. By 10, she could execute emergency landings that left his professional colleagues shaking their heads in disbelief. They'd gather around the simulator afterward, these pilots with thousands of flight hours, discussing this small girl's instinctive understanding of energy management and control authority like she was a fellow professional rather than a child who should have been playing with dolls. Her mother had laughed affectionately at their obsession, calling them her aviation nerds, while supporting every hour they spent discussing aerodynamics, weather systems, and crisis management protocols that commercial pilots hoped never to encounter in their entire careers. "You two would discuss aircraft systems at a birthday party if I let you," she'd tease, but her eyes held nothing but love and pride for her passionate husband and equally passionate daughter. After the accident, Maya's grandparents had wanted to remove all reminders of aviation from her life, thinking it would help her heal. They didn't understand that aviation wasn't just her father's profession, it was their shared language, their connection, the foundation of everything he'd taught her about facing fear and solving problems. She'd fought to keep the manuals, the models, the simulator access that one of her father's friends still provided monthly. Aviation wasn't what took her parents away. It was what kept them alive in her mind. The first indication of trouble came without warning, violent and terrifying. A sharp bang resonated through the cabin, violent enough to jolt passengers from their entertainment screens and conversations. The sound was wrong, not the dull thump of turbulence or the groaning complaint of an airframe under stress, but something metallic and catastrophic, like a massive hammer striking the fuselage with tremendous force. The aircraft shuddered with a distinct vibration that felt fundamentally wrong to Maya's trained awareness, a resonance that spoke of structural damage rather than normal atmospheric disturbance. Around her, passengers exchanged nervous glances, uncertain whether the disturbance represented normal turbulence or something more concerning. Some laughed nervously, making jokes about bad airline food causing turbulence. Others gripped their armrests with white knuckles, instinct warning them that something was seriously wrong even if their minds couldn't identify what. Maya's hands gripped her armrests as she recognized the sound, not turbulence, not typical mechanical stress, but something catastrophic impacting the aircraft structure with tremendous force. Her mind immediately began running through possibilities. Bird strike at this altitude was virtually impossible, engine failure would sound different, structural failure of the airframe itself was statistically almost non-existent in modern aircraft. But something had hit them, and hit them hard. Oxygen masks dropped from overhead compartments with startling suddenness, yellow cups dangling before shocked faces as confused passengers struggled to process the emergency unfolding around them. The cabin pressure had dropped significantly, that distinctive popping sensation in the ears that indicated rapid altitude change or cabin depressurization. Maya's mind raced through the implications as she pulled her mask on with automatic precision, the way her father had taught her during their countless emergency drills at home. He'd made her practice with actual aircraft masks he'd obtained for training purposes, drilling the procedure until it became muscle memory. "In a real emergency, you won't have time to think," he'd explained. "Your hands need to know what to do automatically while your mind focuses on analysis and problem solving." Rapid decompression suggested fuselage breach or door seal failure, serious but survivable if the pilots responded correctly according to established procedures. The aircraft would need to descend immediately to breathable altitude, below 10,000 feet where supplemental oxygen wasn't necessary, and divert to the nearest suitable airport. Uncomfortable and frightening for passengers, but routine for professionally trained crews. She waited for the captain's voice, expecting the calm, professional announcement that would explain the situation and reassure everyone that procedures were being followed and everything was under control. That announcement was part of crew resource management training, keeping passengers informed reduced panic and helped them comply with emergency instructions. The aircraft began descending rapidly, engines throttling back as pilots initiated emergency descent to reach breathable altitude below 10,000 feet. Standard procedure for decompression events. Maya felt the familiar pressure change in her ears, the sensation of rapid altitude change that would be uncomfortable for most passengers but reassuring to anyone who understood it meant the crew was responding correctly to the emergency. She watched other passengers fumbling with masks, trying to calm crying children while flight attendants moved through the cabin with urgent efficiency and forced composure. Their training was evident in every movement, helping passengers secure masks, checking seatbelts, preparing the cabin for potential emergency landing. This was manageable. Frightening for untrained passengers but well within crew capabilities. Maya forced herself to breathe steadily through her mask, fighting the anxiety that wanted to overwhelm her rational thinking with primal fear. Fear was natural, her father had taught her, but it needed to be acknowledged and controlled rather than allowed to dictate actions. Feel the fear, he'd said. Recognize it. Thank it for trying to keep you safe. Then put it aside and focus on solving the problem. Then the second catastrophic failure occurred. The port engine exploded with tremendous force, a massive concussion that threw debris against the fuselage with metallic screams that sounded like the aircraft itself was dying. The explosion wasn't just loud, it was a physical force that rippled through the airframe, a violence that passengers felt in their bones and knew instinctively was beyond any normal operational parameters. Maya's window was on the starboard side, but she could see the reflection in the dark glass, a flash of orange flame, a spray of debris, the sudden darkness where engine lights should have been. The explosion was followed by eerie silence as the portside engine died completely, its contribution to thrust vanishing instantly. The aircraft yawed violently to the left, the asymmetric thrust causing immediate directional instability that threw passengers against their restraints with brutal force. Maya felt her stomach drop as the plane's attitude changed dramatically, nose pitching down at an angle that triggered every alarm her extensive training had embedded in her consciousness. This wasn't emergency descent procedure. This was loss of control, the beginning of a departure from stable flight that could cascade into something unsurvivable if not corrected immediately. She looked out her window with growing horror and saw the starboard engine, her side, trailing smoke from what appeared to be debris impact damage. Pieces of the port engine had likely struck the starboard engine during the explosion, a nightmare scenario where one engine failure causes damage to the remaining engine. The starboard engine was still running but clearly compromised, its exhaust stream dark with smoke, its sound pattern irregular and strained even through the cabin insulation. That wasn't just engine failure. That was catastrophic uncontained disintegration, where the engine literally tears itself apart and sends turbine blade fragments through the surrounding structure like shrapnel through tissue. Her father had made her study every major engine failure in aviation history. She knew that uncontained failures were rare but devastating, often causing damage far beyond the engine itself. Hydraulic lines ran near the engines. Fuel lines. Control cables. A single piece of turbine blade moving at supersonic velocity could sever systems throughout the wing structure. The starboard engine's sound changed again, becoming more irregular, more violent, the sound of machinery tearing itself apart under stresses it was never designed to withstand. Maya's engineering knowledge, cultivated through hundreds of hours studying aircraft systems, painted a clear picture: debris ingestion, internal damage, cascading failure imminent. She closed her eyes and ran through the implications with cold analytical precision. Dual engine failure over the Atlantic Ocean, hundreds of miles from any suitable diversion airport. Likely hydraulic damage from the explosion. Possible fuel system damage. Flight control degradation. Multiple systems cascading into failure as the initial catastrophe triggered secondary disasters throughout the aircraft's interconnected systems. She'd studied these scenarios in simulators, the nightmare situations where one emergency compounds into multiple failures that push beyond any single problem solution and into the realm of unsurvivable disasters. United Airlines Flight 232 had lost all hydraulics but still had engines for directional control. DHL Flight 2003 survived total hydraulic loss by using engine thrust alone. The Gimli glider landed without engines but had intact hydraulics. She couldn't think of a single case study where an aircraft survived both total engine loss and hydraulic failure. Not one. In the cockpit. Captain Richard Hayes stared at his instrument panel in disbelief, watching systems fail in rapid succession across his displays like dominoes falling in predetermined patterns. The screens that normally showed green status indicators and normal parameter readings were now a cascade of red warnings and failure messages scrolling faster than he could read them. 28 years of flying experience, 15,000 flight hours across multiple aircraft types, and he'd never encountered anything approaching this catastrophic convergence of failures. He'd trained for individual emergencies, engine failures, hydraulic failures, electrical problems, but never this nightmare combination where everything failed simultaneously in ways that eliminated every recovery option in his extensive playbook. The port engine was gone, completely destroyed by what appeared to be uncontained failure that sent turbine fragments through critical systems like shrapnel through tissue. His engine instruments for the port side showed nothing, not even error messages, just blank screens that indicated total loss of all engine systems and sensors. The starboard engine was dying before his eyes, temperature readings climbing into the red zone, vibration monitors showing destructive levels that indicated imminent catastrophic failure from debris ingestion and internal damage. He had maybe 2 minutes of thrust from that engine, maybe less, before it tore itself apart or automatically shut down to prevent fire. Hydraulic pressure dropping across all 3 independent systems, co-pilot Emma Vasquez reported, her voice steady despite the terror she felt watching their options evaporate one by one. Her hands moved across the overhead panel with practiced efficiency, attempting to restore pressure through backup pumps and alternative pressure sources, but every action yielded the same result, continued pressure loss across all systems. All 3 systems? Hayes couldn't keep the disbelief from his voice. The Boeing 777 was designed with 3 completely independent hydraulic systems precisely to prevent total hydraulic failure. Each system had separate pumps, separate reservoirs, separate routing through the airframe. The statistical probability of losing all 3 simultaneously was so remote that emergency procedures barely addressed it beyond land as soon as possible. Confirmed, Vasquez replied grimly. Primary, secondary, and standby hydraulic systems all showing 0 pressure. We're on direct mechanical linkage only. Hayes felt ice form in his stomach. Direct mechanical linkage, the backup cable system that connected the control yoke to flight surfaces, provided minimal control authority, barely enough to prevent complete loss of stability, certainly insufficient for landing or even controlled flight for more than a few minutes. Commercial aircraft weren't designed to fly without hydraulics. The forces required to move flight surfaces at high speed were too great for human strength alone. The starboard engine's failure warning sounded, a harsh alarm that confirmed what he already knew. They were now an engineless glider with minimal control, descending toward the Atlantic Ocean at a rate that mathematics said would end in unsurvivable impact in approximately 8 minutes. Hayes keyed the radio, contacting air traffic control with information he never imagined delivering in his entire career. His hand trembled slightly on the microphone, and he forced steel into his voice through sheer professional willpower. Mayday, Mayday, Mayday. Atlas 616, multiple catastrophic failures. Total hydraulic loss across all systems, dual engine failure imminent. Declaring emergency. He paused, watching the Atlantic Ocean appear through breaks in cloud cover far below, calculating their descent rate against remaining altitude with the cold mathematics of physics that didn't care about hope or prayers or the 247 people depending on him to find a solution that didn't exist. The numbers were unforgiving, brutal in their clarity. Without engine power, without hydraulic systems, with minimal control authority from mechanical linkage alone, they were falling from the sky in a barely controlled descent that would end in impact with the ocean's surface in approximately 8 minutes. The air traffic controller's voice came back immediately, professional but unable to completely mask his concern. Atlas 616, roger your mayday. We're activating all emergency response protocols. Nearest diversion is Shannon, Ireland, 230 nautical miles northeast. Can you make Shannon? Hayes looked at his instruments, did the mental calculation that any pilot could perform instantly. 230 miles at their current ground speed would require approximately 25 minutes of controlled flight. They had maybe 8 minutes before impact, probably less. Negative, Shannon. We cannot make any diversion. We are going down. Ocean ditching imminent. His voice cracked slightly on the last word, the professional veneer fracturing under the weight of what he was saying and its terrible implications. Vasquez was working through emergency checklists with fierce concentration, her fingers flying across her electronic displays, pulling up every relevant procedure and backup system activation sequence. But each action yielded the same result: failure messages, error codes, systems that refused to respond because the fundamental infrastructure required to operate them no longer existed. "Captain," she said quietly, and something in her tone made him turn to look at her fully. Her face was pale but composed, accepting. "There's nothing left to try. Every backup system requires hydraulic pressure or engine power that we don't have. The ram air turbine is deployed, but the generator can only provide electrical power, not hydraulic pressure. We're out of options." Hayes had known it already, but hearing it spoken aloud made it real in a way that instrument readings hadn't. They were going to die. All of them. In approximately 7 minutes, this aircraft would hit the Atlantic Ocean at a speed and angle that would crush the fuselage like an aluminum can, killing everyone aboard instantly. He'd trained his entire career to prevent this moment, had studied every accident, every near miss, every emergency recovery in aviation history. But sometimes, the universe assembled a combination of failures so perfect, so comprehensive, that even the best training and experience couldn't overcome basic physics and mathematics. He made the decision that would haunt him for the rest of his life, however long that might be. Keying the cabin intercom, he spoke with brutal honesty that shattered the hope passengers still desperately clung to. His voice would be recorded on the cockpit voice recorder, preserved forever as evidence of these final moments. "Ladies and gentlemen, this is the captain." He paused, swallowing hard, forcing the words out. "I need you to know that we are experiencing catastrophic multiple system failures. We have lost both engines and all hydraulic systems. We are descending toward the ocean surface, and I must be honest with you, we have no ability to recover from this situation." His voice cracked slightly, the professional veneer fracturing under the weight of his words and their terrible implications. Behind him, he heard Vasquez inhale sharply, heard her whisper something that might have been a prayer. "We are going down. I'm deeply sorry. Please brace for impact and know that I am fighting to the very end. I'm so sorry." The cabin erupted into absolute chaos. Screaming passengers embraced loved ones desperately, prayer voices rising in multiple languages as people confronted the terrible reality of their final moments on Earth. Children cried in confusion and terror, their young minds unable to fully process what was happening but sensing the adults' fear and responding to it viscerally. Parents tried desperately to comfort them while their own tears flowed freely down faces contorted with grief and fear and desperate love for children they were about to fail in the most fundamental way possible. Flight attendants fought to maintain composure, moving through the cabin helping passengers into brace positions while their own minds reeled with the knowledge that all their training, all their safety procedures, meant nothing against the physics of an aircraft falling from the sky with no way to stop it. Some passengers pulled out phones, typing final messages to loved ones, recording goodbye videos with shaking hands, leaving last words that might somehow be recovered from wreckage and delivered to families. Others simply held each other and waited for death to claim them, finding comfort in human connection during their final moments. One man in first class sat calmly, eyes closed, hands folded, lips moving in silent prayer. A young couple in their 20s clutched each other, their honeymoon trip to Europe ending in nightmare. An elderly woman kept repeating, it's okay," to no one in particular, trying to comfort herself with words that held no meaning. Maya heard the captain's words through her oxygen mask, felt the panic exploding around her like a physical force threatening to overwhelm her reason. The woman next to her was sobbing uncontrollably, clutching a photo of her children. Behind her, a man was vomiting from pure terror. Across the aisle, a teenager was screaming for his mother. But instead of surrendering to terror like everyone around her, Maya's mind shifted into the analytical mode her father had cultivated through years of emergency training and crisis simulation. It was like a switch flipping in her consciousness. Emotion didn't disappear, but it separated from her analytical processes, allowing her to think clearly despite the fear. The captain had said they lost both engines and all hydraulics. Catastrophic, certainly, but not necessarily unsurvivable if approached from unconventional angles that standard training didn't cover. Her mind raced through her encyclopedic knowledge of aviation disasters and miraculous recoveries, through every case study her father had made her analyze. United Flight 232 in Sioux City had survived total hydraulic failure by using differential engine thrust for directional control, but they'd had engines. DHL Flight 2003 survived hydraulic loss over Baghdad the same way. Same problem, no engines available. The Gimli glider had landed without engines after running out of fuel, but that Boeing 767 had intact hydraulics providing full control authority. The Ethiopian Airlines hijacking ended with a water landing that killed most passengers, but the pilots had maintained some control and some survivors had escaped. Statistical survival rates for ditching operations hovered around 50% under optimal conditions, full control authority, shallow glide angle, proper preparation time, calm seas. Those survival rates dropped catastrophically when control was compromised, when impact velocity exceeded design parameters, when structural integrity was already compromised. The adults had given up because conventional aviation knowledge said they were doomed. Every emergency procedure, every recovery technique, every documented survival had involved at least one functional system, engines or hydraulics or both. Nobody had ever recovered from total loss of both simultaneously. But Maya's father had taught her that conventional knowledge represented the baseline, not the absolute limit of possibility. The people who advance aviation are the ones who look at what everyone says is impossible and ask, but what if, he told her dozens of times. Every breakthrough in safety came from someone refusing to accept that a certain failure mode was simply unsurvivable. An image flashed in her mind, one of their last simulator sessions, just weeks before the accident. He'd programmed an impossible scenario, dual-engine failure with total hydraulic loss over the ocean. She'd asked him why they were practicing something that was statistically impossible and essentially unsurvivable. Because, he'd said, his eyes serious, someday, somewhere, that impossible situation is going to happen to someone. And if they've never thought through unconventional solutions, if they've only practiced by-the-book responses, they'll die without ever trying options that might work. I want you to be able to think beyond the book, beyond conventional wisdom, to see solutions where others only see certain death. She stood up. The action was so decisive and purposeful that nearby passengers paused their prayers and panicked to stare at her in confusion. A 12-year-old girl, small for her age, moving with purposeful calm through a cabin consumed by absolute terror. Her hands were steady as she removed her oxygen mask. They'd descended below 10,000 feet where supplemental oxygen wasn't necessary. Her eyes held determination that seemed impossible for someone so young facing certain death along with everyone around her. "Sit down, honey," the woman next to her sobbed, reaching for Maya's arm with desperate fingers. "There's nothing anyone can do. Stay with us. Pray with us. Don't die alone." Maya gently but firmly pulled away, moving toward the forward cabin with steps that never wavered despite the aircraft's increasingly unstable pitch and roll. Every few seconds the plane would shudder, dip, the nose pitching down at alarming angles as the pilots fought with controls that barely responded. Passengers watched her pass, their reactions ranging from confused concern to complete incomprehension. Some tried to grab her and pull her back to safety that didn't exist, others were too consumed by their own terror to notice a child walking purposefully through the chaos toward the cockpit. "Someone stop that child," a man shouted. "She's in shock, she doesn't know what she's doing." But something in Maya's demeanor, something in the way she moved with such purpose and confidence, gave pause to those who might have physically restrained her. She didn't move like a panicked child. She moved like someone with destination, with knowledge, with a plan that nobody else could see but that was absolutely clear to her. Flight attendants saw her coming, and Senior Flight Attendant Jennifer Martinez positioned herself near the cockpit door, initially moved to block Maya's approach. Martinez had been flying for 16 years, had handled countless passenger situations, but she'd never seen a child move through a dying aircraft with such focused purpose. "Sweetheart, you need to sit down and brace," Martinez said, her voice cracking despite her training. She was trying to maintain professional composure while internally preparing for her own death in the next few minutes. "I know you're scared, but please. I need to speak to the captain immediately," Maya interrupted, her voice cutting through the chaos with startling clarity and authority that seemed impossible from such a small person. "I have information that could help. Please. I know what I'm talking about. My father was Captain David Chen. I've trained for this exact scenario." Martinez felt her breath catch. David Chen. She knew that name. Every pilot in the industry had known David Chen, legendary for his emergency procedure expertise, his unconventional thinking, his ability to find solutions where others saw only problems. He died 2 years ago in that training accident, and the industry had lost one of its brightest minds. This was his daughter. Something in Maya's eyes, in that voice that held knowledge and confidence far beyond its years, made Martinez pause. They were all going to die anyway in less than 5 minutes. What harm could a child's words possibly do in their final moments? Maybe she needed to tell the pilots something important. Maybe her father had taught her something relevant. It didn't matter. Nothing mattered except the terrible mathematics of their descent and the ocean surface rushing up to meet them. She stepped aside, opening the cockpit door that regulations said should remain locked during flight. But regulations meant nothing when the flight itself was ending in catastrophic failure. Maya stepped into the cockpit. The flight deck was a symphony of warning lights and alarms, displays showing red failure messages, the sound of multiple alert systems competing for attention. 2 pilots fought controls that barely responded, watching altimeters unwinding toward zero with terrifying speed, trying desperately to coax stability from an aircraft that physics and aerodynamics said should already be tumbling out of control into an unrecoverable spin. They didn't notice her initially, their attention completely locked on the impossible task before them and the ocean surface rushing up to meet them. Hayes was pulling back on the yoke with both hands, his muscles straining against control forces that required hydraulic assistance. Vasquez was attempting to deploy spoilers manually, her hands working emergency backup systems that were never designed to be operated in flight. Maya took a deep breath, summoning every ounce of confidence her father had spent years building in her through endless training and encouragement. She channeled his voice, his calm demeanor in emergencies, his absolute refusal to accept defeat until physics made it impossible. She spoke 4 words that would change everything. "I can fly this." Captain Hayes whipped around, his expression cycling from shock to confusion to anger in rapid succession. A child stood in his cockpit, a small 12-year-old girl with serious eyes, claiming she could fly an aircraft that he, with nearly 3 decades of experience and extensive emergency training, had just acknowledged was unflyable and doomed. The absurdity would have been laughable if they weren't all about to die in minutes. Part of his mind registered that she shouldn't be in the cockpit at all, that she should be in the cabin in brace position like every other passenger, waiting for the impact that was now inevitable. "What? No. Get back to your seat immediately," Hayes snapped, his voice sharp with stress and fear. "Flight attendant, get her out of here now." "Listen to me for 30 seconds, Maya said urgently, moving closer to the instrument panel, her voice remaining steady despite the captain's dismissal and anger. "You announced total hydraulic failure across all 3 systems, correct? And you've lost both engines. You're trying to control the aircraft using direct mechanical linkage to the flight control surfaces, but the effectiveness is minimal without hydraulic assistance. Your descent rate is approximately 4,500 feet per minute, and at current altitude you have less than 6 minutes before impact with the ocean surface." Hayes froze, his anger momentarily displaced by shock at the technical precision of her statement and the vocabulary she was using. This wasn't a terrified child babbling nonsense during extreme stress or repeating phrases she'd heard on television. This was someone who understood aircraft systems and their current crisis with disturbing accuracy and professional-level technical knowledge. "Who are you? How do you know this terminology? How do you—" He couldn't even complete the question, his mind struggling to process what was happening. "My father was Captain David Chen," Maya said, and she saw recognition flash in both pilots' eyes. He flew for Pacific Airways for 20 years before he died in a training accident 2 years ago. Vasquez gasped audibly. David Chen was your father? Maya nodded. Before he died, he taught me everything he knew about aviation. Not just basic flying, emergency procedures, crisis recovery, scenarios that commercial training doesn't cover because they're considered too unlikely or theoretically impossible to survive. We spent hundreds of hours in professional flight simulators running worst-case emergencies exactly like this one. She moved closer, her eyes scanning the instrument displays with trained comprehension that looked impossibly practiced for her age. She read the displays as fluently as reading text, seeing the story they told about the aircraft's rapidly degrading condition. This is the scenario we practiced more than any other, she continued, her voice urgent but controlled. He made me run it dozens of times because he said that someday, somewhere, this impossible combination would happen to someone, and they'd die without ever trying unconventional solutions. He wanted me to know there were options. Co-pilot Vasquez stared at the girl in absolute disbelief, her hands frozen on controls that barely functioned. I knew David. I flew with him twice on international routes to Tokyo. He was legendary in the pilot community for his emergency procedure knowledge, for thinking outside conventional parameters. But you're just a kid. Even if he taught you things, you can't possibly have the experience to. Experience in normal situations, no, Maya interrupted, aware that every second mattered. But how many pilots have experience with total engine and hydraulic failure? Nobody does, because everyone who encounters it dies before they can practice or learn from it. But I've practiced it 17 times in simulators with my father guiding me. That's more relevant experience than anyone else on this aircraft. Hayes felt something shift in his mind. The girl made a logical point, absurd as the whole situation was. He had zero experience with this scenario because it wasn't survivable by conventional methods. But maybe this child, trained by one of the industry's most brilliant unconventional thinkers, had knowledge he didn't. What are you proposing? He asked, his voice slightly less hostile, touched by desperate hope. There's a technique called propulsion-controlled aircraft operation, Maya explained rapidly, watching precious seconds tick away. It was developed after United 232 crashed in Sioux City, Iowa. Pilots learned they could control aircraft using only engine thrust when hydraulics fail completely, advancing one engine and throttling back the other to create yaw for turns, using pitch to control altitude. But you don't have engines, I know. Then what good? Hayes started. But you do have the auxiliary power unit, Maya continued. The APU. It's a small turbine engine in the tail section that provides electrical power and pneumatic pressure for ground operations and emergency backup. It produces thrust, not much, maybe 800 pounds at maximum output, but it's something. It's located in the tail, which means its thrust vector can be used for pitch control if we're careful. Hayes felt his breath catch in his throat. The APU. He'd never thought of it as a propulsion source. It was barely powerful enough to taxi an empty aircraft on the ground, designed purely for power generation. But she was right that it produced thrust. Minimal, but not zero. Even if we could use APU thrust for pitch control, Vasquez said slowly, her engineering background engaging with the problem, we'd still need some way to control roll and yaw. The mechanical linkage gives us almost nothing. Emergency pneumatic systems, Maya said immediately. The aircraft has backup compressed air systems designed to provide limited hydraulic power for exactly this kind of catastrophic failure scenario. The compressed air can temporarily pressurize hydraulic actuators, not for long, maybe 90 seconds before the air exhausts, but it's enough. Combined with differential spoiler deployment and tactical use of remaining battery power, we can create enough control authority to significantly reduce descent rate. Hayes stared at this small 12-year-old who was calmly discussing compressed air systems and hydraulic actuator emergency modes while his aircraft fell from the sky. Everything she said made theoretical sense from an aerodynamic and systems perspective, but theory and practice were vastly different when you were falling from the sky in a crippled aircraft with 247 lives depending on your decisions. That's insane, he breathed, his mind racing through the implications. Even if the APU could provide minimal directional control, even if we could get 90 seconds of hydraulic pressure, we're gliding without power. We're falling. There's no way to generate sufficient lift without engines providing forward thrust. You don't need to generate lift for sustained flight, Maya explained rapidly, speaking faster as altitude continued unwinding with merciless consistency. You need to control the descent rate enough to survive impact. Ocean ditching with a controlled descent rate under 500 feet per minute has survivability rates above 60% if the fuselage remains reasonably intact and you maintain level attitude. Your current descent rate of 4,500 feet per minute guarantees complete structural failure on impact and near certain death for everyone aboard. She locked eyes with Hayes. But if we can reduce that rate significantly, if we can maintain level attitude with wings level, if we can choose our impact point to parallel the wave formations instead of hitting them perpendicular, we have a legitimate chance. Not a good chance. Not a great chance. But better than zero, which is exactly what you have right now with conventional approaches. The cockpit fell silent except for the warning alarms and the sound of rushing air outside the damaged airframe. Hayes stared at this child who spoke with such confidence about scenarios he'd never even imagined attempting. Every instinct screamed that what she was suggesting was impossible, that it violated everything he'd learned in 3 decades of flying. But she was absolutely right about one critical thing: they currently had zero chance of survival. Continuing their current approach, fighting controls that barely worked while falling toward the ocean, guaranteed death for everyone aboard without question. It was mathematical certainty, physics unwilling to negotiate. Attempting her impossible suggestion might kill them all anyway, probably would, if he was being honest. But at least they'd be fighting intelligently instead of just struggling uselessly against forces they couldn't overcome. He looked at Vasquez, saw her wide eyes, saw her slowly nod. "You really think this could work?" Hayes asked, hating the desperate hope creeping into his voice. "I've done it in simulators 17 times, Maya said with absolute confidence. Different failure scenarios, different atmospheric conditions, different aircraft loading, but the fundamental principles are identical. My father made me practice until I could land a 777 with nothing but APU thrust and emergency pneumatic systems. He said that real pilots aren't the ones who follow checklists perfectly in normal conditions. Real pilots are the ones who find solutions when every system and every manual says there isn't one." Vasquez had been frantically searching through emergency procedures on her electronic display, pulling up technical information about APU thrust characteristics and pneumatic backup systems that she'd never needed before in her entire career. The information existed in the aircraft manuals but buried deep in technical appendixes that pilots never consulted during normal operations. "Captain," she said quietly, her voice trembling, "the APU produces approximately 800 pounds of thrust at a vector approximately 15 degrees downward from horizontal because of its installation angle in the tail section. If we could somehow redirect that thrust vector using the tail surfaces, and if we could get even partial hydraulic pressure restored to the inboard ailerons and elevators for just 60 to 90 seconds. She trailed off, her mind simultaneously seeing the theoretical possibility and the massive practical challenges. It was the kind of thing that might work in a simulator where variables could be controlled and attempts could be repeated. In reality, with one chance, with damaged systems, with incomplete information about what still worked. "For minutes to impact," Hayes announced grimly, looking at his altimeter. They were passing through 6,000 feet in a descent so steep it was almost a controlled fall. He made the decision that would define the rest of his life, however long that might be. He unbuckled his harness and moved to the jump seat behind the captain's position, gesturing Maya toward the captain's chair with hands that trembled slightly despite his efforts to remain composed. "If you're going to do this, you need to do it now. Sit down. Emma, talk her through the systems and monitor everything. I'll handle communications with ATC and backup monitoring." He took a deep breath. "God help us all." Maya slid into the captain's seat, and immediately the challenge became apparent. Her feet barely reached the rudder pedals even with the seat adjusted fully forward to its minimum position. Her hands gripped controls that felt massive in her small fingers, the yoke designed for adult male pilots, not preteen girls. But muscle memory from hundreds of simulator hours took over automatically. She'd sat in this exact position countless times, her father adjusting the seat the same way, compensating for her size with technique and knowledge. He'd told her that flying was about understanding and finesse, not physical strength, that the best pilots were the ones who could read situations and respond with precision rather than brute force. This was real. Not a simulator where failure meant reset and try again. The screens before her showed real altitude unwinding, real descent rate that would kill them, real consequences if she failed. Real people in the cabin behind her, praying and crying and holding each other, depending on her to do something that probably couldn't be done. But fear would kill them all faster than the ocean. She pushed it aside with conscious effort and became what her father had trained her to be, a pilot finding solutions where others saw only doom. APU is already running for electrical power, Vasquez reported quickly, her hands moving across overhead systems panels with practiced efficiency. Switching it to maximum thrust output mode now. That's going to drain our battery reserves much faster, but... She didn't finish the sentence. Battery life didn't matter if they were all dead in 3 minutes. Tail surfaces first, Maya said, her voice dropping into the calm, professional tone she'd heard her father use during emergencies, that tone that said everything was under control even when it wasn't. Deploy the rudder full left, then center. I need to feel the response time and confirm the mechanical linkage is still functional. Her hands moved across controls with practiced precision, finding the manual rudder deployment system that provided direct cable linkage to the tail surfaces. These cables ran through the aircraft structure, mechanical backups that didn't depend on hydraulics or electronics, just physics and steel cables pulling on control surfaces. The aircraft yawed slightly to the left, minimal movement but enough to confirm the control actually worked and could influence their trajectory. Without hydraulics, the control forces were enormous, requiring significant physical effort to move surfaces designed to be hydraulically actuated. Good, Maya breathed, relief flooding through her briefly. The mechanical linkage is intact. Emma, I need you to manually activate the pneumatic emergency system. There's a switch on the overhead panel, red cover, labeled emergency pneumatic backup. When I give the word, flip it. That'll give us approximately 90 seconds of hydraulic pressure before the compressed air system exhausts completely. We need to use those 90 seconds at exactly the right moment for maximum effect. She was speaking like a seasoned captain giving orders to her co-pilot, and Vasquez found herself responding automatically to that tone of authority despite its source being a child young enough to be her daughter. Hayes was on the radio, speaking to air traffic control with words that would be forever preserved in aviation history recordings. His voice was steady now, accepting, focused entirely on documenting what was happening for the investigation that would follow. Atlas 616, we are attempting an unconventional recovery procedure guided by a passenger with advanced aviation knowledge and emergency training. If this works, we'll need all available rescue assets positioned at our ditching coordinates immediately. If it doesn't work. He paused, emotion threatening to overwhelm his professional composure. Tell our families we fought to the very end and didn't surrender. The air traffic controller's voice came back, thick with emotion. Atlas 616, all rescue assets are being positioned. Coast Guard has helicopters en route. Royal Navy has ships diverting to your coordinates. You're not alone. Fight for every second. 3 minutes to impact. Maya could see the ocean surface now clearly through the windscreen, waves reflecting moonlight in patterns that would have been beautiful under any other circumstances. The Atlantic was relatively calm tonight, with swells maybe 6 to 8 feet, much better than it could have been. But even calm seas would be like hitting concrete at their current descent rate. She calculated wind speed by watching whitecap formations, estimated wave heights from the foam patterns, identified the optimal impact vector that would parallel the wave formations rather than hitting them perpendicular and risking the aircraft nose diving into a wave and cartwheeling. All the countless hours of study, all her father's lessons about weather and water landings and ocean conditions, coalescing into practical knowledge at the exact moment of truth. He'd made her study ditching videos, made her analyze every water landing in aviation history, made her understand the physics of impact with water surfaces. Deploying spoilers asymmetrically, she announced, her hands moving with practiced precision despite their slight trembling. The spoilers were small panels on the wings designed to disrupt airflow, reduce lift and increase drag during landing. By deploying them unevenly, more extension on one side than the other, she could create differential drag that would help turn the aircraft. It was an unconventional use of spoilers, not in any manual, but it was physics. More drag on one side created yaw. Basic principles. Combined with minimal APU thrust and tactical rudder deployment, it might provide enough control authority to actually manage their descent trajectory instead of just falling helplessly. The aircraft responded sluggishly, like a massive ship being pushed by a child, but it responded. The yaw rate changed slightly, the nose coming around a few degrees toward her intended direction. It felt like trying to steer an ocean liner with a canoe paddle, theoretically possible but requiring absolutely perfect timing and deep understanding of the forces involved. Maya felt sweat running down her back despite the cool cabin temperature maintained by emergency air systems. Every micro-adjustment had to be perfect. Too much control input would induce a spin they'd never recover from at this altitude. Too little would leave them plummeting into the ocean at an unsurvivable angle and speed. 2 minutes 15 seconds, Vasquez called out, her voice tight with tension. Descent rate still 4,200 feet per minute. Altitude 3,100 feet. Not yet, Maya murmured, her eyes locked on her instruments with absolute focus that seemed to block out everything else. We're still too high and too fast. I need to bleed off more airspeed and stabilize our descent vector before we attempt hydraulic recovery. If we restore hydraulics now and it doesn't work perfectly, we won't have time or resources for a second attempt. We only get one shot at this. Her voice was so calm, so professional, so completely at odds with her age that both pilots found themselves trusting her instinctively despite the absurdity of their situation. In the cabin behind them, passengers had fallen into eerie silence, past the point of screaming, simply holding each other and waiting for the impact they'd been told was inevitable and unsurvivable. Some had noticed the aircraft's attitude changing slightly, the terrifying descent becoming marginally less steep, but most attributed it to final death throes or autopilot systems fighting uselessly against physics rather than actual human-directed recovery attempts. Flight attendants remained at their stations, maintaining professional composure and helping passengers with brace positions while internally preparing for the end of their lives. Many were praying. Some were crying silently. All were trying to be strong for passengers who needed them. Nobody knew that a 12-year-old girl sat in the captain's seat, fighting physics and aerodynamics with knowledge her dead father had gifted her through years of obsessive training and love that transcended normal parent-child teaching. 1 minute 45 seconds. Altitude 2,600 feet. Descent rate 4,100 feet per minute. Maya could feel the aircraft's energy state, that indefinable sense pilots developed through experience of knowing exactly where their aircraft existed in the three-dimensional solution space of flight possibilities. Speed, altitude, descent rate, attitude, all these variables intersecting to define their current state and the range of possible futures branching from this moment. They were descending too fast but reasonably stable considering the circumstances. The minimal APU thrust was keeping them from tumbling uncontrollably but couldn't reduce their sink rate significantly. She needed the hydraulics desperately, needed that brief window of enhanced control authority to do what seemed impossible, convert their death plunge into something marginally survivable. The math was brutal. At current descent rate, impact would occur at roughly 2,400 feet per minute vertical velocity. That was far beyond survivable limits for a water landing. The fuselage would crumple like paper, crush zones designed for runway landings offering no protection against forces 3 times greater than their design parameters. But if she could use that 90 seconds of hydraulic pressure to arrest their descent, pull the nose up, reduce their vertical velocity to under 500 feet per minute, they entered the realm of possible survival. Unlikely survival, but possible. 1 minute 18 seconds. Altitude 2,000 feet even. Time seemed to slow down and speed up simultaneously, seconds feeling like hours while also flashing past faster than thought. Maya's training and instinct were merging, her conscious mind and subconscious experience working in perfect synchronization. "Prepare to activate emergency pneumatic on my mark," Maya commanded with absolute authority. "Emma, 3, 2, 1, mark." Vasquez threw the emergency switch. Deep in the aircraft's belly, compressed air at 3,000 psi flooded into hydraulic system lines, temporarily pressurizing actuators that had been dead moments before. High-pressure air forced into hydraulic fluid reservoirs, pushing that fluid through lines to control surface actuators, bringing dead systems temporarily back to life. Control surfaces that had been frozen suddenly gained responsiveness, hydraulic pressure readings climbing from 0 to operational range in seconds. Maya felt the transformation instantly. The controls in her hands went from barely functional to genuinely responsive with real authority. The yoke that had required enormous physical effort suddenly moved smoothly, hydraulic assist systems providing the mechanical advantage that made precise control possible. She had 90 seconds of actual flying capability before the pneumatic pressure exhausted and returned them to manual-only control that was essentially useless. 90 seconds to do the impossible. She pulled back firmly on the yoke, feeling the elevators bite air and change their pitch attitude significantly. The nose came up, still descending rapidly but at a noticeably reduced angle. Her feet worked the rudder pedals in coordination with aileron inputs, keeping the wings precisely level despite the asymmetric forces acting on the damaged aircraft. 25 seconds elapsed. The hydraulic pressure was already beginning to drop as compressed air exhausted through the system, the temporary gift of control authority beginning its inevitable decline toward uselessness. The needles on the hydraulic pressure gauges were visibly falling, marking off their remaining time with merciless consistency. 58 seconds to impact, Hayes called out, his voice cracking. Descent rate dropping, 3,600 feet per minute. Altitude 1,200 feet. Maya ignored the countdown numbers, flying purely by instinct and deeply ingrained training, making micro-adjustments that seemed impossibly precise for someone her age with no actual flight time. She deployed flaps using emergency extension systems, sacrificing precious airspeed for increased lift coefficient, trading their forward momentum for additional seconds in the air. The aircraft shuddered violently, systems screaming protests at configurations that exceeded design parameters and manufacturer recommendations, but it responded exactly as aerodynamic principles said it should. The flaps increased wing camber, increased lift, increased drag. They were slowing down, losing precious airspeed, but converting that speed into lift that reduced their sink rate. Every choice she made was based on principles her father had drilled into her consciousness through endless repetition. When conventional methods fail, physics still applies universally. Energy can be redistributed, forces can be redirected, and aircraft fundamentally want to fly if pilots give them any possible chance. 38 seconds. Descent rate 2,800 feet per minute. Altitude 750 feet. The ocean surface rushed toward them with absolutely terrifying speed despite the reduced descent rate. Maya could see individual waves now, could calculate their impact point with awful precision based on their current trajectory. The waves were running northwest to southeast, driven by prevailing winds. She was angling their approach to parallel those waves, hitting them lengthwise rather than across their direction of travel. The hydraulic pressure had dropped below useful levels, the brief gift of enhanced control exhausted. But she'd accomplished what she needed. Their descent rate had dropped into the theoretical survivable range under perfect conditions, and their attitude was nearly level, wings horizontal, nose only slightly down. They would hit hard, harder than any designed landing, but they would hit level, and that single factor made all the difference between catastrophic disintegration and structural survival with casualties but survivors. 22 seconds. Descent rate 2,000 feet per minute. Brace for impact. Brace, brace, brace. Hayes' voice echoed through the cabin intercom, and passengers who had been frozen in terror or prayer suddenly remembered their training, remembered the flight attendants' demonstrations, tucked their heads down and braced against seats in front of them. Maya's hands remained perfectly steady on controls that barely responded anymore, making final micro-adjustments to keep the wings exactly level as the ocean surface filled her entire windscreen. The world narrowed to just the instruments and the approaching water, time dilating as adrenaline flooded her system. Her father's voice echoed in her memory from their countless training sessions, from their last simulator session just weeks before his death. When you've done everything you can, when physics takes over and control leaves your hands, trust your preparation completely and don't flinch at the last second. Fear kills more pilots than crashes ever do. Stay with the aircraft until the end. Fly it into the ground, or in this case, the water. Never give up control until physics takes it from you. She didn't flinch. Her hands stayed firmly on the controls, maintaining inputs even as they became increasingly useless, flying the aircraft with pure willpower and determination until the instant the tail struck water with tremendous force, the impact so violent it sounded like an explosion, absorbing the initial impact energy before the fuselage belly impacted with a massive crash that threw everyone forward violently against restraints. Water exploded across the windscreen in a solid wall, blinding white foam blocking all vision. The cabin pressure hull groaned under forces it was never designed to withstand, metal protesting with sounds like screams. The deceleration was brutal, forces that would have killed unrestrained passengers, but everyone was braced, everyone was secured. But the level attitude held perfectly. The wings stayed attached despite stresses that exceeded design parameters. The fuselage remained intact despite the tremendous impact forces that would have destroyed them at higher speeds or wrong angles. They were sliding across the water surface now, momentum carrying them forward in a long glide across wave tops, gradually bleeding off speed through friction and hydrodynamic drag. They were down. They were in the water. Against all odds and physics and conventional wisdom, they were alive. The aircraft settled into the water, floating despite the damage, the fuselage hull providing enough buoyancy to keep them on the surface. But that wouldn't last long. Stress fractures were already allowing seawater to flood into the cabin through multiple breach points. Emergency exit doors blew open automatically, slide rafts deploying with compressed air hisses that sounded impossibly loud after the crash silence. Flight attendants sprang into action with their training taking over completely, evacuating passengers into rafts with practiced efficiency despite their shock and disbelief at being alive. Evacuate. Evacuate. Move to the rafts. Jennifer Martinez was shouting, her voice hoarse but strong, pushing passengers toward exits, helping elderly passengers and children, counting heads, ensuring nobody was left behind. Cold Atlantic seawater was flooding into the cabin through stress fractures in the hull, rising steadily up the aisle, maybe 6 inches per minute, but slowly enough that evacuation proceeded without panic. The aircraft would sink eventually, probably within 20 minutes, but they had time. People who minutes ago had accepted certain death now scrambled onto rafts, helping each other, crying with relief and shock at the absolute miracle of continued existence. Strangers embraced strangers. Parents clutched children. Prayer voices rose in thanks rather than desperation. Hayes, Vasquez, and Maya were the last to leave the sinking cockpit, the captain physically carrying the small 12-year-old through the flooding cabin and onto a raft. His legs felt like rubber, adrenaline crash hitting him with delayed force. He set Maya down gently and found tears streaming down his face despite his efforts at professional composure. Around them in the moonlit Atlantic, 247 people bobbed in ocean swells and orange life rafts, watching their aircraft sink beneath the surface with surprising grace, the massive Boeing 777 disappearing into black water stern first, the nose pointing at the sky until the last moment when it too slipped beneath the waves. The scene illuminated by moonlight would be burned into their memories forever, orange survival rafts floating on an empty ocean, passengers huddled together crying and praying, and rescue helicopters already visible on the horizon, their searchlights sweeping the water. Hayes pulled Maya close and found he couldn't stop the tears. How did you do that? That was impossible. That shouldn't have worked. Nobody could have done what you just did. Maya looked at him with eyes that had seen too much for 12 years, eyes that held knowledge of loss and purpose and the weight of 247 lives saved through pure determination and unconventional thinking. My dad always said that impossible just means nobody's figured out how to make it possible yet, she said quietly. He taught me to look for solutions where everyone else only sees problems. He taught me that giving up is the only real failure, that as long as you're trying something, even if it's unconventional or seemingly crazy, you're still fighting. Vasquez wrapped emergency blankets around both of them, her own tears flowing freely. Your father would be so proud of you. David Chen gave aviation so much during his life, but his greatest gift was preparing you for this moment. You saved us all. The rescue helicopters arrived 28 minutes later, finding all 247 passengers and crew alive, floating in organized rafts, relatively calm despite their ordeal. The Coast Guard personnel couldn't believe what they were seeing, a successful Atlantic Ocean ditching with 0 casualties, accomplished through techniques that didn't exist in any manual by a 12-year-old girl who shouldn't have been able to reach the rudder pedals. The story would dominate aviation news for months, the miracle of Atlas Flight 616, the 12-year-old who saved a plane using her father's unconventional training, the impossible survival that redefined what the industry thought was possible. The incident would lead to changes in emergency training, new procedures for handling compound failures, renewed respect for unconventional thinking in crisis situations. But in that moment, Maya simply closed her eyes and whispered to her father across whatever divide separated the living from the dead. I did it, Dad. Just like we practiced. I hope I made you proud. And somewhere beyond, a father watched his daughter achieve what he'd spent years preparing her for, facing the impossible with courage, intelligence, and determination that transformed certain doom into miraculous survival. The ocean was calm. The stars were bright. And 247 people lived to see another day because one small girl refused to accept that impossible meant impossible. She'd proven that sometimes, impossible just means nobody else has figured it out yet.